Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg defended President Biden's decision to forgo a visit to East Palestine, Ohio, telling CNN's Don Lemon it could potentially have disruptive effects on the town's cleanup efforts. Let's watch.
Do you think that the President Biden, should visit and speak with families there?
Well, what I know is he's been very concerned throughout this process about what the people of East Palestine are going through. I think also a visit at that level can sometimes have a lot of disruptive effects, so would need to be thought of carefully. But I'm certainly glad that I went.
Since the February 3rd train derailment that spilled toxic chemicals, the rural community has swiftly worked to clean up the mess. The White House contends that a visit from the president, which would require ample security arrangements, could disturb the process, which sounds flatly unbelievable. President Biden just went to Ukraine. Did he disturb? They're having a war. Was the war effort disrupted by his ample security needs?
Excellent point, Robby. I mean, the man lives in Washington, D.C. We all know what motorcades are like and how disruptive those can be. The idea that he can't skirt around the edges of a town of 5,000 people without being overwhelmingly disruptive seems a little far-fetched. Now, look, there have been arguments made that to go without some, plan of action is nothing more than a stunt. There have been criticisms from liberals that what Donald Trump did with his, Trump-branded water and McDonald's appearances was merely a stunt. But here's what so many politicians don't understand, especially contemporary politicians. Stunts can be part of politics. And if you've made a name for yourself as Amtrak Joe, the guy who loves trains more than anyone else in America, there is a train derailment that has become national news and which is being, you could say exploited by the right, you can say legitimately boosted by the right because of sincere concerns, maybe a little bit of both, and used for political ends. The idea that you identify it as a stunt and then choose not to participate in what is clearly a very useful political exercise is an odd self-own. Moreover, there is legislation that's come out from Democrats to improve railway safety. If you want to change the narrative and actually do something constructive for the people of Palestine or people who could be harmed from these accidents in the future, go there and talk about actual reforms that can be made to make it less likely that communities like this are at risk. That's what you can do. That's how you can turn a stunt to something politically useful. And instead of doing that, we just get more of this foot shuffling from the administration.
I mean, imagine if Biden had said, or Secretary Pete had said on his behalf, he can't visit right now because he's working too hard to propose a regulatory package or whatever, or making sure he's signing the dotted line on imposing this massive fine on this company. But it wasn't that. It was no.
Listen, it's an hour flight to Ohio. It's not difficult. It's not far. I just don't understand at this point.
Even he can take the train. He likes taking the train. It's more than an hour train ride.
I don't. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I just fundamentally don't understand why he also doesn't say, "I'm going in a month." Just pick a date in the future so that people stop asking.
But how does he know he won't have to go to Ukraine that day?
Oh, goodness gracious. I mean, that is the contrast that keeps getting raised, and one that Biden is not going to be able to escape from. I don't know what bubble he lives in where he thought that he could. Look, it was the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. I understand what the timing of that was. But this train derailment happened on February 3rd. His trip to Ukraine was in the latter half of February. There has been a lot of time before and since where he could have made a trip to East Palestine, or at very least announced his intention to go. At very least confronted people's frustrations directly about why he hasn't gone. Because I promise you, whatever you say about Joe Biden, he's pretty good at retail politics. And I'm sure his explanation for why he hasn't gone is going to come off as more folksy, warm, and understandable as Pete Buttigieg is filibustering there. Well, part of the ongoing conversations about this disastrous derailment is how rail companies can be on the hook for disasters like the one in East Palestine, and more importantly, how to prevent them. When asked what can be done to make the fines for accidents of this magnitude, quote, mind-boggling high, here's what Buttigieg said yesterday on MSNBC's Morning Joe.
There is this statutory limit on the fines that we can assess. And I think that they need to be much tougher. The legislation that's been put forward in the Senate is one example of a way to do that. I think it pegs it to 1% of the company's income. And that's something that would be more likely to get their attention.
Now, Buttigieg went on to say that currently the maximum fine a rail company can face is about $225,000, even when fatalities occur. Pegging it to 1% of a company's earnings, that's exactly the kind of thing that basically ensures that there's never sufficient incentive for a company to change its behavior.
Right. The best thing to do, from my standpoint, is to incentivize safe behavior by having a stiff penalty that they actually have to take full responsibility for the harm that results. That way, you ideally incentivize the company to figure it out. Because I don't necessarily know that the government knows exactly which brakes should be used or how many people should be on each train. Probably the people who work on the train and the train company have better experience. Yeah. But if the incentives are bad, they know, but they might cut corners if they're not fully on the hook or fully liable. So you punish them, you make them make it right, and that would be, from my standpoint, the ideal way to not have things like this happen.
Yeah, the irony is that it was Norfolk Southern itself who was one of the leading champions of this new electronic braking system, bragging about it and how it was going to make their trains better and their services better. And it was only once they were faced with the regulatory reality of being forced to put it on all of their trains or some percentage of their trains that they started pivoting hard to lobbying against it, dumping millions of dollars into both parties, but disproportionately one Republican senator in particular, who went on to brag when ultimately what he had proposed, which was this new cost-benefit analysis under the Trump administration, which changed the numbers of the Obama-era cost-benefit analysis to say, now it's not in our favor. There's not enough benefits for us to actually implement this life-saving braking system.
So then what do you think about what I'm saying? So I would leave the train company can decide what kind of brakes it wants on each train, but if the train derails, then you pay $1 gazillion or whatever it is to fix it. So then you would think that would be, again, they're just profit seeking. They want to maximize profits, but then in order to maximize profits, they can't take those risks. And they're the right people to determine that.
So I hate to keep bringing up my podcast, but I actually just had my old torts professor on, who was also my corporate law professor, to talk about this exact issue and the realities of what claimants face in these circumstances. Because what ends up happening is because the legal system, one, makes it so difficult to show causality, a relationship between especially long-term harms like getting cancer 20 years later and the event itself. Because litigation is so expensive, the people in East Palestine, many of them were given $500 to $2,000 to help with relocation and stuff by the train company. And people are happy to take it when they're desperate and they have nowhere to go and they can't afford a hotel room.
Okay, but if there's a big settlement potentially in the mix, I mean, trial attorneys will come to represent. They'll take some of the eventual settlement money, obviously, but.
So the reality is we saw this play out in a very similar crash in 2012 in New Jersey. In that case, residents, most of them took very small $2,000 payoffs, basically. There was a class action in some group settlement, but it was closed by the court, so we don't actually know the terms of that settlement. Mm-hmm. But historically, what ends up happening is that because the people are at a so much worse bargaining position, they ultimately never recoup the full value of the harms that they actually suffered. So there's this interesting equation, it's like a law and economics equation that you can do that says, if I sell Coca-Cola, if I sell soda, and I can sell it in a glass can, in a glass container or a metal container, the metal containers are more expensive. I lose a little bit of money by putting it in metal. But one out of every 100,000 glass ones blows up, explodes in somebody's face, and causes them a lot of harm, right? If the cost that I have to pay to you for the glass bottle exploding in your face is less than the cost I have to pay to switch over to aluminum cans, I'm always going to use aluminum cans. So if I can keep your damage amount just low enough, then I don't care about your face being disfigured forever. I don't care about long-term environmental harms. I don't care about any of that. Even if I pay out something, as long as the full cost of what I've done are externalized in some part onto you, my behavior, my production of this good is always going to be excessive, inefficient, like a disruption in the market. So the problem is that our legal system has demonstrated itself to be completely unable to fully force people to internalize costs.
Well, then I would say I would want potentially, using that example, I would want reforms to the legal system so the payout for the exploding in your face can would be higher. And
I agree. And that's why there's this conversation about whether we should have things like strict liability. What has actually happened, and I don't say this because I'm trying to beat up on people or point fingers, but there was a huge movement in the 90s around tort reform, a conservative movement that was actually trying to do the opposite, to make it harder for litigants to get judgments for these kinds of tort harms that befell them. And it was a corporate-backed movement precisely for this reason, because they understood that if you could sue McDonald's for an injury that was the result of coffee that was so hot that it burned down to your pubic bone and you had to get skin grafts on your private parts as an elderly woman, if you actually could get huge judgments out of companies like that, then companies would have to change their behavior. And they wouldn't be able to profit by superheating up their coffee so that they could earn a penny on a fraction of a penny on a dollar of every sale. And so there was this movement to really vilify people who were suing and saying that they were ambulance chasers and that they were trying to exploit companies and that it was really their own bad behavior and their own bad choices that led them to
I don't feel
outcomes.
That way about civil liability. Obviously, there would be room for different takes on some of these different things, but a train transporting hazardous chemicals would seem a different case.
I'd agree, but unfortunately, our regulatory system and our lobbying system felt very differently.
Well, we will keep following this. Stay with us. We'll have more Rising in just a minute.